Rome whispered about her name long before she was old enough to wear the golden stola of maidenhood. Livia Valeria Augustus, daughter of Emperor Marcus Valerius, granddaughter of emperors, heir to bloodlines that carried both mortal steel and divine flame. And yet, she was alone. No man, no senator, no general, no prince of foreign lands dared linger in her presence. All who came to court her fled in terror, as if Venus herself had marked her with scorn. The 7 reasons they fled. The curse of Venus. It was said that Venus, offended by Livia's birth, cursed her cradle. Any man who tried to claim her hand would be stricken with misfortune, nightmares that left them screaming, sudden accidents in the baths, shadows whispering in their ears. Many suitors left Rome trembling, swearing her eyes burned with divine fire in the moonlight. The fire in her eyes. By day, she was fair hair of pale gold, skin smooth as polished ivory. But at night, her eyes glowed faintly in lamplight, like embers under ash. One suitor swore that when he leaned close, he saw flames dancing in her pupils. He fled the palace before dawn, leaving behind his gifts and slaves. The silence of statues. Those who dined with her claimed the marble statues in the palace gallery turned their heads ever so slightly to watch her. One senator's son swore he heard Apollo's statue whisper her name. He was found later in his villa, raving and clawing at his ears. The shattered dreams. Every suitor who courted her was tormented by dreams of drowning in rivers of blood, or lying beside her only to wake and find her face replaced by a skull crowned in roses. A Greek prince leapt from a ship at harbor, screaming that her kiss had followed him into sleep. The falling rose petals. Whenever she walked in the palace gardens with a man, roses turned black and dropped their petals in heaps at her feet. One bold general who dared to pick one as an offering pricked his finger on a thorn and died 3 days later of fever, though no wound was found. The voice in the temple. A suitor once brought her to the temple of Venus herself, seeking to prove that the goddess blessed their match. But as soon as Livia touched the altar, a voice thundered through the columns, "Not yours. Never yours." The suitor fled Rome that night and shaved his head to join a monastery in Gaul. The emperor's wrath. The final reason was not divine, but mortal. The emperor himself, weary of losing suitors, grew paranoid. He warned men that whoever tried and failed to claim her would meet not only Venus's curse but the wrath of Rome itself. For what man, however brave, could face both god and emperor? And so Livia, the most desired princess in the empire, was left unwed, her chambers echoing with silence. At 14, she should have been surrounded by noble women, gossiping of betrothals and weddings. At 16, she should have been promised to a prince of Greece, a king of the East, or a senator's son to secure alliances. But at 18, she sat alone in her marble chamber, watching the oil lamps flicker. The curse hung about her like a shroud. Slaves entered her room with their eyes lowered, careful never to speak more than was required. Even the palace dogs whimpered and avoided her touch. Livia hated it. She was not a phantom. She was not a cursed omen to be avoided like plague. She was flesh and blood, young and restless, her heart aching for anything that might prove she was alive. And it was then, during one late afternoon when the air smelled of laurel and sweat from the servants' courtyard, that she heard the voice that would change everything. "Move," the boy said bluntly. Livia blinked, startled. She had wandered into the servants' quarters by accident, carrying her basket of embroidery. She stood in the doorway, blocking the passage where linens hung drying on ropes. The boy was tall, broad-shouldered despite his youth, his tunic worn and stained from work. His eyes, dark as olive wood, met hers directly, without bowing, without fear. "I said move," he repeated, stepping closer. "I need those linens. You're in the way." No one had ever spoken to her like that. Livia's lips parted, words tangled on her tongue. But instead of anger, she felt a hot thrill, something fierce, something alive. The boy brushed past her, unbothered, gathering the clothes into his arms. He didn't even glance back. For the first time in her life, she had been treated as though she were ordinary. That night, as the palace grew quiet and the moonlight fell across the marble halls, Livia lay awake smiling. She didn't even know his name. But she knew she would find him again. Livia could not forget him. She told herself it was nothing, that he was just a servant boy, bold from ignorance. Perhaps he hadn't even realized who she was. Perhaps he would be punished if anyone found out. Yet the memory of his voice, so sharp and unflinching, echoed in her ears. Move. You're in the way. Not princess, forgive me, not Lady Livia. Just, move. It was absurd. It was dangerous. And yet, she found her feet wandering more and more often toward the servants' courtyard. The second time came 3 days later. She lingered in the shade of an olive tree near the kitchens, a cloak pulled over her stola. The air smelled of smoke and bread, and the voices of slaves rose in tired chatter. And there he was. Carrying amphorae of water on his shoulders, sweat gleaming on his neck, the boy moved like someone who knew the weight of the world. He set the jars down with a grunt and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. Livia's heart leapt, absurdly, as though he were some foreign prince in polished armor. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. You work harder than the others, she said, her voice too soft. He looked at her, really looked. Not at her jewels, not at her fine sandals, but straight into her eyes. Work is work, he said simply. No one thanks you for it. And then he turned away, lifting the amphorae again, walking on without bowing. Livia stood frozen. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. The third time, she sought him out deliberately. She told her maid she wished to walk in the orchard and dismissed the girl when she reached the far wall. Slipping through the archway that led to the laundry courts, her pulse raced like a guilty child's. He was there again, hanging wet tunics on the rope. His tunic clung to his shoulders, his hands rough and quick with the work. You there, she said, louder this time. He glanced at her, brow furrowing. Again. She tilted her chin, trying to sound imperious, but her heart fluttered. You don't bow. You don't call me by title. Why? The boy shrugged. Why should I? You put your toga on the same way I put on my tunic. Her mouth opened, scandal, outrage, disbelief tangled together. Then she laughed, a sound she had not heard from herself in years, light and ringing. He watched her strangely, as though her laughter was more shocking than her presence. What's your name? She asked when her laughter faded. He hesitated. Then, grudgingly, Cassius. For weeks, she found excuses to slip away, sometimes to the laundry courts, sometimes to the stables, sometimes to the gardens where Cassius carried baskets of fruit. Always, they exchanged words too daring, too ordinary for a princess. Do you never tire? She asked once, watching him scrub armor for the palace guard. I tire, he said, flexing his arms. But if I stop, no one eats. The palace doesn't run on gold. It runs on backs like mine. You speak as if you despise it. Not despise. It's just the truth. And in his eyes, she saw something that unsettled her more than any curse, more than any omen: honesty. But honesty is dangerous in a palace of masks. One evening, her father passed her chamber as she hurried back from the servants' court. He stopped, his gaze narrowing. You smile too much these days, Emperor Marcus said slowly. His voice was heavy as marble, his presence filling the hall. Has a suitor returned? Have you been keeping secrets from me, daughter? Livia froze, her heart hammering. She bowed her head to hide her trembling lips. No, father. No one would dare. The emperor's eyes lingered, sharp and suspicious. But he turned away at last, muttering, good. Let Venus keep her cursed prize to herself. By now, she could not stop. She found herself drawn to Cassius like a moth to flame. Each word he gave her was worth more than a senator's poetry, more than a general's vow. She learned he was from the countryside, son of a farmer ruined by taxes. He had come to the palace as a servant when his family could no longer feed him. He spoke little of sorrow, but much of labor, of sweat, of survival. And Livia listened as she never had before. The marble colonnade glowed silver in the moonlight, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The night was still, too still, save for the trickle of water from the fountain. Livia froze, her laughter cut short as her father's voice rolled through the air. Daughter. The word was thunder in the silence. Cassius turned. The linen he had been folding slipped from his hands and fell into the fountain with a splash. His dark eyes widened as he saw the man before him, not a fellow servant, not a senator, but the emperor of Rome himself. Marcus Valerius stood tall, his purple-edged toga flowing like a shadow, his face carved with fury. "Do you mock me, Livia?" the emperor growled. "Do you dishonor your blood, your empire, by consorting with a slave?" Livia's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to run, to shield Cassius from her father's wrath, but her feet held fast. Cassius dropped to his knees, trembling. His head bowed so low his forehead brushed the marble. "Imperator, forgive me. I did not know." The emperor's voice cracked like a whip. "Did not know? You stand in the gardens of the Palatine Hill, speaking freely to the blood of Augustus, and you dare say you did not know?" Cassius' breath came quick, ragged. He had worked in the palace for years, but he had never once expected to look upon the emperor's face, let alone stand accused beneath his gaze. Livia stepped forward, her voice breaking through her fear. "Father, he didn't know who I was. I disguised myself, I went to him, not the other way. Punish me, not him." Her words hung in the air like fire. The emperor's eyes flashed, cold and merciless. A princess does not lower herself. A princess does not sneak into the shadows to play at being a servant. You shame your family, and for what? A boy who does not bow until he sees my face. Livia swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. He is the first man who does not tremble at me. The words slipped free before she could stop them. The emperor stiffened, his fury bending into something darker. He turned his gaze on Cassius, studying him as though he were a strange beast. "You," he said slowly. "Did you not dream? Did you not see fire in her eyes? Did Venus not curse you as she cursed every other man?" Cassius lifted his head, just enough to speak. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "I dream, my lord. But not of her curse. I see only the fields where I was born, the river where I swam as a boy. I sleep soundly." The emperor's frown deepened. He stepped closer, looming over him. "You are untouched by it." Cassius dared to look up, though fear tightened his jaw. "I don't know why, Lord. Perhaps the gods have no care for me. I am beneath their notice." Livia's breath caught. Beneath their notice. That was it, wasn't it? The curse had struck every man of power, every man of status, every suitor who sought her hand for ambition or pride. Venus had marked her as untouchable to kings and senators, to princes and generals. But Cassius was no suitor. He was a servant boy, the son of a farmer, a man with nothing to gain by claiming her. Perhaps Venus's curse had simply overlooked him. Or perhaps, she thought with a shiver, Venus had spared him for reasons yet unseen. Marcus Valerius circled them, his sandals striking the marble like the tread of war drums. His face was unreadable, his eyes sharp. "At dawn," he said at last, his voice like iron, "the boy will be whipped for daring to speak to my daughter without leave. And you, Livia, you will not leave your chambers until I decide what is to be done with you." "No," Livia cried, rushing forward. She fell to her knees before him, her golden hair spilling across the marble. "Father, I beg you. He is innocent. He has done nothing but work. It was I who sought him out. I who—" Silence. The word cracked like a spear. Livia bit her tongue, trembling, her eyes burning with tears. Cassius kept his head bowed, his body rigid as a statue. He did not beg. He did not weep. Only his clenched fists betrayed his fear. The emperor turned his back on them both and strode into the shadows of the colonnade, his voice echoing behind him. "Dawn will decide the fate of this foolishness." And then he was gone. Livia sank to the ground, shaking. She reached out to Cassius, her hand brushing his. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Cassius looked at her, his face pale, his jaw tight. "You're the princess." She swallowed hard. "Yes." For a long moment, neither spoke. The moonlight shone between them, cold and cruel. And then, softly, Cassius said, "Why me?" Her breath caught. "Because you are the first man who has ever seen me, not the curse, not the crown. Just me." Cassius' gaze lingered on her, torn between fear and something else, something like fire. But before either could say more, the night guards arrived to drag him away. The palace stirred with the first pale light of dawn. Marble pillars glowed faintly pink, the air damp with the chill of morning. In the servants' court, a wooden post had been set in the center, ropes dangling like hungry serpents. Cassius stood there, stripped to the waist, his wrists bound to the beam. His back was bare, muscles tensed like coiled rope. Around him, servants gathered in silence, some with pity, some with fear, none daring to speak. The lictor raised his scourge, its leather thongs studded with bone. By command of the emperor, the man barked, Cassius the servant is to receive 20 lashes for insolence against the royal house. The whip hissed through the air. Crack. Cassius grunted, his body jerking against the ropes. Blood welled on his back. Livia stood hidden behind the columns, her fingers digging into the marble. She could not breathe. Every strike was a knife in her chest. Stop this, she whispered, though her voice could reach no one. Crack. The sound echoed off the walls. Servants flinched. Cassius bit down on his cry. His jaw trembled, his breath ragged, but he did not beg. Livia's nails cut crescents into her palms. The urge to run forward, to throw herself between the whip and his flesh, nearly consumed her. But her father's guards lined the courtyard, their spears gleaming. To defy them was to invite ruin. From the balcony above, Emperor Marcus Valerius looked on with arms folded. His face was a mask of stone, though his eyes flickered with something Livia had never seen before, not anger, not pride, but unease. After the 7th lash, he leaned toward his advisor. Does he not cry out? The old man, Lucullus, shook his head. No, Imperator. He endures. The emperor's gaze narrowed. He muttered, half to himself, even generals have screamed by the 3rd strike. Why not him? Livia, listening from the shadows below, caught the words and clung to them with a trembling heart. When the 10th lash struck, Cassius sagged against the ropes, his breath hissing, but his voice remained silent. His eyes found the ground, but in them burned something fierce, not submission, but defiance. The emperor frowned. This is no ordinary servant. Lucullus bowed. Perhaps Venus spares him, sire. Or perhaps, Marcus growled, the gods mock me, giving my cursed daughter a man who feels no curse at all. At last, after the 15th lash, Marcus raised his hand. Enough. The lictor froze mid-swing. The courtyard stilled. Cassius hung against the post, his back blooded, his chest heaving. Untie him, the emperor commanded. His voice echoed across the marble. The ropes fell away. Cassius collapsed to his knees, the flagstones slick beneath him. But even then, he did not bow his head. He lifted it, slow and deliberate, and his eyes, dark, steady, unbroken, met the emperor's. For the first time, Marcus Valerius faltered. That night, Livia slipped into the servants' infirmary where Cassius lay. The air smelled of herbs and smoke. He was bandaged, his skin raw, but his eyes opened when she entered. You shouldn't be here, he rasped. You shouldn't have been whipped, she whispered back. Her hands shook as she sat beside him, brushing damp hair from his brow. He tried to smile. Better me than you. Tears blurred her vision. Why don't you fear me, Cassius? Why don't you run like the others? He stared at her, his breath shallow. Because I don't see a curse. I see you. And you are worth the pain. Her chest ached as though his words were lashes of their own. She leaned closer, her lips trembling above his. But before she could close the distance, footsteps echoed down the hall. A guard's voice cut through the silence. The emperor summons the servant boy at dawn tomorrow. He wants to know why Venus spares him. Livia's blood turned to ice. In his chamber, Marcus Valerius stood before the statue of Venus, the torchlight flickering across his stern face. If this boy is beyond your curse, he murmured, voice low, then I must know why. If he is chosen, I will use him. If he is blessed, I will bend him. No man defies me, not even one the gods protect. And though he did not admit it aloud, another thought gnawed at him. If Venus had spared the boy, perhaps it was not to mock him, but to challenge him. The next dawn would not bring whips. It would bring questions, trials, and the start of something none of them could control. The emperor's eyes were two blazing coals fixed upon the boy. Servants bowed low, some trembling, others scuttling away like startled birds. The great hall seemed to shrink in on itself, marble columns looming like the bars of a cage. The princess stood frozen beside the servant boy, her fingers clutched at the folds of her gown as if the silk could shield them both. "Who is this?" The emperor's voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough to slice through air. The boy dropped to his knees, forehead pressed against the cold stone floor. His pulse hammered in his skull. He could not look up, not into that storm. "Forgive me, divine Caesar," he stammered, his voice quivering though he fought to steady it. I did not know." "She never said." "Never said?" The emperor's voice rolled with dangerous amusement. He rose from his throne, each step echoing like thunder on the marble floor. "Do you mean to tell me you did not recognize my blood, my daughter, the Princess Aurelia?" The boy swallowed hard. His palms slick with sweat pressed against the stone, he whispered, "To me, she was only a girl." The emperor stopped short. The court murmured, scandal and disbelief rustling like dry leaves. Aurelia, cheeks aflame, took a step forward, her voice small but unwavering. "Father, he speaks the truth." The emperor turned, his gaze heavy upon her. "And what truth is this, child?" "That for once, someone saw me as I am," she said. "Not as a cursed jewel to be feared, not as a vessel for alliances or ambition, but as myself." Her words pierced the silence like a blade. For a moment, even the braziers seemed to burn quieter. The boy dared to lift his eyes, just enough to see the princess standing there, trembling yet resolute, her gaze locked on her father's. The emperor studied them both, his jaw set, his breath measured. Then, in a low voice, one meant for the gods as much as men, he asked, "Why has Venus spared you, boy? Why has her curse not touched your flesh?" The boy's heart lurched. He had no answer, no reason he could give. Yet even as fear gnawed at him, something stirred, deep and unshaken. The memory of Livia's laughter, the quiet strength in her defiance, the way her eyes softened when she was not watched by the world. He took a trembling breath and said, "Perhaps, Caesar, the goddess cannot curse what is honest. I never sought her hand, nor her throne. I only spoke as one soul to another. That is all I ever saw." The court held its breath. Livia's lips parted, her eyes wide with the fragile hope she dared not voice. The emperor loomed above them, shadow and fire, and for the first time in years, uncertainty flickered across his face. The emperor's silence stretched like an unstrung bow, taut and dangerous. Every noble, every servant, every guard in the hall held themselves rigid, waiting for the strike. Livia could hear her heartbeat in her ears, fierce and desperate, like a war drum. If her father condemned the boy, if he ordered his execution before her eyes, she would shatter, curse or no curse, princess or no princess. She stepped closer, planting herself between the emperor and the kneeling servant. "You will not harm him," she said, her voice breaking at first, then finding steel. "He has shown me more truth than all the suitors you paraded before me. If Venus herself cannot touch him, then perhaps the gods have chosen him." Gasps erupted through the chamber like sparks from a fire. Nobles recoiled in disbelief. Livia had spoken against her father, the Emperor of Rome, the man whose word was law. The emperor's eyes narrowed, lines deepening on his brow. "Daughter," he said slowly, dangerously, "you speak as though you forget who you are. You are Rome itself. And Rome does not bind itself to peasants." The boy flinched at the word, but Livia lifted her chin. "Then perhaps Rome has forgotten what it means to be human." For the first time, the emperor faltered. It was not defiance he saw in his daughter, it was fire. Not the wild, cursed flame that had driven suitors into madness, but something sharper, truer. His gaze slid to the boy, who still knelt, trembling yet refusing to crawl backward. "You," the emperor growled, his voice low, "stand." The boy obeyed, legs unsteady, but he rose to his full height. He was not tall, not strong like the warriors who once courted Livia. His hands were rough with labor, his tunic plain, his face pale with fear. Yet he stood. The emperor circled him as though he were prey. "Do you love her?" he demanded. The boy's throat tightened. He had not dared to name it, not yet, not even in his own heart. But standing there, Livia's presence beside him like a steady flame, the truth left his lips before he could choke it down. "Yes." The word rang out, small yet unshakable. Livia's breath caught. The emperor's lips curled into something between fury and disbelief. Then understand this, he thundered, his voice shaking the marble columns. If you wish to stand beside my daughter, you will prove yourself. You will not run as the others did. You will face the curse itself. The court erupted into whispers, like the hissing of snakes. Livia's hand flew to her mouth. Father, no. Silence, he snapped, and his command cracked like lightning. His gaze burned into the boy. At the next full moon, you will stand before Venus' altar. If the curse is real, it will claim you. If it spares you, then perhaps the gods have spoken. The boy's knees quivered, but his voice came out firm, steadier than he thought possible. So be it. And in that instant, Livia's eyes met his, wide with fear and fragile hope, and he knew that no curse of heaven or earth could frighten him more than the thought of leaving her. The palace changed after that day. Whispers clung to its halls like smoke. Every servant knew the emperor's decree, every noble watched the boy as if he were already a ghost. They whispered of madness, of blood on marble, of the goddess vengeance. Some wagered how quickly he would fall. Others pitied him, shaking their heads, muttering that a servant had no right to dream of a princess. And yet he endured. He scrubbed the same floors, carried the same baskets, mended the same torn cloaks, though eyes followed him everywhere. Each night, when the moon rose, he lay awake, wondering if it would be his last, staring at the shadows as though Venus herself waited to strike. Livia could not stand it. She began slipping away from her chambers under the veil of night, her slippers silent against the cool stone floors. She found him where he always worked too late, bent over some menial task as though it might anchor him against the storm. You shouldn't be here, he would whisper, not looking up, fear thick in his voice. If your father finds you, let him, she said fiercely. What more can he do? He already condemns you to Venus' wrath. At those words, he looked at her then, his eyes soft with something that pained her. That's not what frightens me. She leaned closer, her heart pressing against her ribs. Then what? That I'll leave you alone in this world, he said quietly. The words unraveled her. For all the suitors who had sung of devotion, who had promised kingdoms and triumphs, none had ever spoken with such naked honesty. She touched his hand, rough and calloused, and for the first time she did not feel cursed at all. The court, however, did not rest. Priests gathered in secret to debate whether Venus herself would appear at the altar. Some feared her wrath would spill onto Rome itself. Senators muttered of omens, a dove found dead in the forum, a star burning too bright above the city, a fountain that ran red with dust. The emperor dismissed them all with a wave of his hand. If the goddess curses him, then Rome will be rid of a fool. If she spares him, his eyes darkened. Then we will know her will. On the eve of the full moon, Livia stole to the boy once more. He was mending a torn cloak in the servants' quarters, his hands shaking though he tried to still them. She came without her jewels, without her silks, only a plain white dress, her hair unbound. You're afraid, she said softly. He gave a hollow laugh. Wouldn't you be? I was born afraid, she whispered, kneeling beside him. Every suitor who looked at me saw only the curse. But you, her hand trembled as she touched his cheek. You see me. Not what the gods made me. Me. His breath caught, and he closed his hand over hers, pressing it against his face as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. Then if I survive tomorrow, he said, it won't be because the goddess spared me. It will be because of you. The bells tolled midnight, heavy and slow. Beyond the palace walls, the moon swelled, silver and pitiless, rising toward its fullness. And all of Rome seemed to hold its breath. The night of the full moon arrived with a heaviness that seemed to press down upon all of Rome. From the Palatine Hill to the crowded streets below, people whispered of the trial to come. Merchants closed their stalls early, mothers barred their doors, and even the soldiers at their posts spoke in hushed tones. Some swore Venus would descend in a storm of fire, others claimed the boy's flesh would blacken and rot the moment he touched the goddess altar. Few dared speak of mercy. The emperor made certain the spectacle would not be private. He commanded the entire court to gather, priests robed in crimson and white, nobles adorned in gold, and soldiers standing in rigid lines along the temple steps. Torches flared in the night wind, casting long, restless shadows across the marble courtyard where the altar of Venus gleamed, a great block of white stone, streaked faintly with centuries of offerings. Livia stood near the front, clad in a gown of pale blue, her crown heavy on her head. She looked every inch the princess, but inside her heart rattled like a caged bird. She searched the crowd, desperate, and then she saw him. The boy was led forward by 2 guards, not in chains but flanked like a prisoner. His tunic was clean but plain, his hands clenched at his sides to stop their shaking. His eyes found hers, only for an instant, and though terror sat on his shoulders, he gave her the faintest nod as if to tell her he still stood, still fought, still belonged to himself. The high priest raised his staff, his voice deep and ringing. "Venus, goddess of beauty, love, and fate, hear us. This man dares stand where others fled. If he is unworthy, strike him down. If he is guilty of presuming against the divine, curse him unto madness. If he is chosen." His voice faltered, the word heavy as stone. "Then let your will be known." The emperor's gaze was hard as iron. "Approach the altar, boy." The crowd hushed. Even the night seemed to still, the rustling of olive leaves silenced, the stars fixed and cold. The boy's feet felt like lead as he mounted the steps. Each pace was a prayer, though he knew no words, only Livia's face in his mind, her voice in his memory. When he reached the altar, he laid his hand upon the cool stone. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the wind rose. Torches flickered violently, throwing the temple into wild shadows. The marble beneath his palm thrummed as though alive, and a voice, sweet, terrible, eternal, echoed in every mind at once. "Who dares defy my curse?" Livia gasped, her hands clenching against her gown. The nobles fell to their knees, some crying out, some covering their faces. Even the emperor's jaw tightened. The boy, trembling, whispered into the darkness, "I do." The wind roared. The torches bent sideways. The voice sharpened like a blade. "And why?" He closed his eyes, every fiber of him screaming to run, but he stood firm. His voice cracked, but it did not waver. "Because I never sought her crown. I never sought her curse. I only saw her. Not as a goddess plaything, not as a jewel in a cage, but as herself. And I love her." The silence that followed was unbearable. The crowd dared not breathe. Livia's tears stung her cheeks, her body trembling as though the goddess gaze burned directly through her. Then, the altar shone. Light spilled from the stone, soft and golden, wrapping the boy like a cloak. The wind stilled. The torches righted. The divine voice, now like a whisper of silk, murmured, "Then love is greater than my curse." And the light faded. The boy still stood, alive, unburned, untouched. The crowd erupted in cries, fearful, awed, some even jubilant. The priests prostrated themselves. Livia's hands flew to her lips, and for the first time since her birth, she felt free of the chains Venus had bound her with. The emperor rose from his throne, eyes blazing. He looked at the boy not with the contempt he once held, but with something far sharper. "Rome has heard the goddess," he declared, voice carrying over the thunderous crowd. "And Rome obeys. This boy has been spared. But he must prove his worth to me before he dares claim what Venus has delivered." His gaze turned like steel. "Tomorrow, he begins." The boy bowed his head, relief and dread tangling in his chest. Livia's eyes found his, shining with pride and terror both. For though Venus had spared him, the emperor was not a goddess and his trials might yet be crueler. The next morning, the palace stirred with an unease that was almost physical. Where the night before had been filled with whispers of curses and gods, today the talk turned to the emperor's command. He had not spoken idly, the boy would be tested, and not by soft measures. The emperor summoned his council at dawn, and the chamber filled with men who weighed loyalty in coin and blood. Livia was not permitted within, though she lingered near the doors, straining to hear the murmurs through the bronze panels. The voices inside rose and fell like the clash of swords, and though she could not catch every word, she heard enough. "Trial of arms," said one. "Trial of endurance," suggested another. "Trial of loyalty," murmured a third, slyly. At last, her father's voice cut through them all. "If the gods have chosen him, then let Rome shape him." He will prove himself in 3 trials: strength, cunning, and devotion. Only then shall we speak of his place beside my daughter." When the doors opened, Livia fled before she could be caught listening. But dread coiled in her chest like a snake. Her father's trials were not games. They were snares, sharpened to break men who thought themselves bold. There, soldiers twice his size jeered openly as they tossed him a wooden sword. A servant with a blade, one mocked. "Shall we polish his sandals for him, too?" Cassius gripped the weapon in both hands, his palms slick, his body untrained. He had lifted baskets, scrubbed floors, carried laundry until his back ached, but never had he faced steel, not even in play. The captain barked an order, and a soldier advanced, striking hard. Cassius' arms shook with the effort of blocking the blow. The clash echoed, splinters flying. He stumbled, yet he did not fall. Again, the captain growled. Hour after hour, they broke him down. He was struck, thrown to the ground, mocked until his ears burned. But when he collapsed, panting in the dirt, he dragged himself up again. Not for glory, not for pride, only because Livia's face lingered in his mind, and her words still clung to his chest like armor. "You see me." By dusk, his body was a map of bruises. His grip shook, his legs trembled, but when the captain snarled, "Yield, boy," Cassius spat blood and whispered, "No." The soldiers, who had laughed at him that morning, now exchanged uncertain glances. The captain's eyes narrowed, not with contempt but with something closer to respect. That night, Livia found him in the barracks yard, slumped against the wall, too exhausted to move. She rushed to him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "You'll kill yourself," she whispered. He tried to smile, though his lip was split. "Better to die for you than live without you." Her throat tightened, her eyes burning. "Don't say that. Don't you dare say that. You must live." His hand found hers, weak but steady. "Then I'll live. For you." The second trial came 2 days later, a test of cunning. He was thrown into the emperor's labyrinth, a twisting garden of hedges and walls, its paths littered with traps and puzzles crafted by Rome's finest engineers. Nobles gathered to watch from towers above, wagering on how quickly he would lose himself. Cassius entered alone, armed with nothing but his wits. The walls loomed high, the hedges thick as stone. He moved slowly, testing the ground, learning to read the faint marks left by builders, listening to the echo of fountains to guess at direction. He was cut, scraped, nearly crushed by a hidden gate of stone, but each time, he found a way through. Hours passed. The crowd above grew restless. Some muttered he would starve in the maze. Livia leaned forward, knuckles white, praying to every god she had ever known. Then, at last, a horn sounded. Cassius emerged from the far gate, filthy, bleeding, but alive. In his hand he carried a golden apple from the labyrinth's heart, the symbol of victory. Even the emperor's lips twitched, almost a smile, though his eyes still burned with the weight of a final measure. That night, as Livia bandaged Cassius' wounds in secret, her hands trembled. 2 trials you have survived. 1 remains. Devotion. Do you know what that means? He winced as her cloth pressed against his shoulder. Loyalty to Rome? She shook her head, tears threatening. No. Loyalty to my father. He will ask you to choose. Between me and him. Cassius froze. The candlelight flickered between them, throwing their shadows together on the wall, as though they were already one. I will never choose against you, he whispered. You may not have a choice, Livia answered, her voice breaking. And that is what terrifies me most. The 3rd trial was announced with the toll of iron bells. Unlike the others, there was no spectacle for the masses, no labyrinth or field of arms. This trial was for the emperor's eyes alone and for the gods who watched. The temple courtyard was empty save for the emperor on his marble throne, a handful of priests, and the guards who flanked the space like shadows. The air was sharp, heavy with incense, as though even the night itself braced for what was to come. Cassius was led forward, his bruises still dark, his body aching from the days before. He bowed, though his knees quivered. Livia stood off to the side, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had begged her father to spare him, to show mercy. The emperor had only looked at her with a cold smile and said, Mercy is the death of Rome. Cassius, the emperor said now, his voice low, rolling like distant thunder, you have endured strength and cunning. But Rome does not prize skill alone. Rome is built on loyalty, on devotion beyond self. Tonight you will prove yours. The boy swallowed hard. How, Caesar? The emperor lifted his hand, and a guard stepped forward, dragging with him a prisoner in chains. The man was gaunt, his tunic stained, his head bowed. When he was forced to his knees, Livia gasped. It was one of the palace scribes, a man who had once shown her kindness in secret, slipping her scrolls of poetry when she was lonely. Marcus, Livia whispered. The emperor's eyes never left Cassius. This man is guilty of theft from Rome's treasury. He was caught with coin that did not belong to him. For that crime, he must die. And you will deliver the sentence. Livia's heart lurched. Father, no. Silence, he thundered, and she flinched. His gaze returned to Cassius. Strike him down. Prove that your devotion is to Rome's law, not to your own heart. Prove that you are not weak, that your love for my daughter has not blinded you to duty. A guard thrust a short sword into Cassius' hands. Its weight felt impossible, heavier than any stone he had ever carried. He stared at Marcus, frail, trembling, his eyes wide with terror. Then he looked at Livia. She shook her head, tears brimming, silently begging him not to do it. Choose, the emperor said, his voice sharp as steel. Rome or ruin. The courtyard fell silent. Cassius' chest heaved, his pulse a storm. He could not kill an innocent man. He could not betray Livia's trust. Yet if he refused, the emperor would see him as a coward and perhaps order his death anyway. Slowly, Cassius raised the blade. The priests bowed their heads. Marcus closed his eyes, whispering a prayer. Livia's cry caught in her throat. Then, with a sudden motion, Cassius turned not toward the prisoner, but toward himself. He placed the blade at his own chest, eyes blazing with desperate resolve. If devotion means blood, Caesar, he said, voice raw but unwavering, then let it be mine. I will not kill an innocent for you. But I will give my life to prove my loyalty. Gasps erupted from the priests. Livia screamed, rushing forward, but Cassius did not flinch. The tip of the sword pressed against his tunic, just enough to draw a bead of blood. For a heartbeat, the emperor said nothing. His face was carved of stone, unreadable. Then, slowly, the corners of his mouth curved not into a smile of warmth, but something colder, sharper, yet laced with reluctant respect. Enough. Cassius froze, the sword trembling in his hands. Livia clutched his arm, pulling him back from the edge. The emperor leaned forward on his throne, his voice low and commanding. You would rather die than betray your conscience. You would bleed before you abandon my daughter's faith in you. That is devotion. The priests bowed, murmuring in awe. Livia clung to Cassius, her tears falling freely, relief shaking her shoulders. The emperor's gaze, dark and fierce, fixed upon them both. Then so be it. The curse has spared you. The trials have not broken you. The gods themselves have spoken.